On a crisp autumn afternoon, a mother's quiet trip to a yard sale would lead her back to the most haunting chapter of her life. Her son, missing for 10 long years, was closer than she ever imagined. What she found that day would unlock a mystery buried in the shadows of the past, where an innocent birthday party had become the start of a nightmare. As she held a familiar object in trembling hands, a flood of memories and unspoken questions would drive her to the edge of truth and beyond. What really happened to her son all those years ago? And who was behind his chilling disappearance? Under the warm September sun, the neighborhood of Willow Creek was alive with color and laughter, as if the world itself had conspired to make this day perfect. Children dashed between yards, their shrieks of joy echoing beneath the gentle rustling of autumn leaves that had just begun to turn. In one corner of the Carter family's well-tended yard, a birthday banner hung from the low-hanging boughs of an ancient oak, and a table was heaped with bright packages tied with ribbons. The smell of fresh-cut grass mingled with the faint scent of cinnamon from the cake resting on the table's edge. Elizabeth Carter, a woman whose kind face bore the faintest lines of worry that only mothers know, stood quietly at the window, watching the party from inside her kitchen. Her son, Ethan, had just turned 8. His laughter, carefree and vibrant, warmed her heart, though a strange melancholy clung to the edges of her thoughts, a feeling she couldn't quite name. Ethan was a lively child, imaginative and full of stories, always with a battered blue Game Boy clutched in his small hands, covered in Pikachu and Charizard stickers that he had carefully placed himself. She smiled as she watched him dart across the yard, chasing a friend who wore a pirate hat far too big for his head. At that moment, her friend Martha appeared at the door, tapping gently on the glass. Martha had a way of smiling that made even the hardest days feel bearable, and today she carried that same warmth with her. "Elizabeth, come out and join us," she urged, her voice soft. But Elizabeth only shook her head, her eyes lingering on her boy. "In a minute," she promised, but her voice sounded hollow, even to her own ears. Martha gave her a look that was both patient and understanding before returning to the party. Elizabeth poured herself a cup of tea, the comforting aroma of chamomile filling the kitchen, though it did little to soothe the knot of unease that had taken root in her chest. She couldn't explain it, a mother's instinct perhaps, but something felt different this year, as if the laughter outside was a fragile thing, ready to shatter at any moment. She forced a smile and stepped out onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under her weight. She scanned the yard, her gaze sweeping over the children, the balloons, the neighbors who had come to share in Ethan's day. But there was no sign of the small teal Game Boy, though she knew Ethan never went anywhere without it. She found it odd, but quickly dismissed the thought. Children left things all the time. Yet, as she watched Ethan disappear behind the row of bushes at the yard's edge, her heart clenched in her chest. A few minutes later, she realized she could no longer hear Ethan's voice. She turned her head, searching the yard. The other children were still playing, their laughter a cheerful backdrop, but Ethan was nowhere in sight. Panic, swift and sharp, surged through her as she moved from group to group, calling his name. Martha noticed her distress and hurried over. "What's wrong?" she asked, but Elizabeth was already striding across the yard, her eyes scanning every inch of green. "He was just here," Elizabeth murmured, her voice trembling. "I saw him run behind the bushes, and now I can't see him." Her words hung in the air, met by the uncertain glances of the other adults. They searched together, their voices growing louder, tinged with fear. But Ethan was gone, vanished as if swallowed by the earth itself. In that moment, the world Elizabeth knew cracked and fell away. The birthday songs and laughter turned to whispers and gasps as neighbors joined the search. Someone called the police, and soon the yard was swarming with uniformed officers and flashing lights. Elizabeth stood frozen, her mind a blur of disbelief and terror. She could still smell the cinnamon from the cake, could still see the empty swing swaying gently in the breeze. But her son was gone. 10 years later, that day would haunt her like a ghost she could never banish. Every year, she marked the anniversary of his disappearance with a small vigil, a single candle flickering in her window, a silent promise that she would never stop searching. The neighborhood had moved on, the children who once played in her yard now grown and gone, but Elizabeth remained, held captive by a past that refused to release her. On a crisp September morning, exactly a decade after Ethan vanished, Elizabeth found herself standing in her living room, staring at the wall where Ethan's picture used to hang. She had taken it down years ago, unable to bear the sight of his bright eyes and hopeful smile. Martha arrived, as she always did, to coax Elizabeth out of the shadows she had built around herself. "There's a community yard sale today," Martha said, her voice gentle but insistent. "Come with me. It'll be good to get out of the house, even for just a little while." Elizabeth hesitated, her mind racing with 1,000 excuses, but she saw the quiet determination in her friend's eyes. She nodded slowly, the wordless agreement a small surrender to a world that kept moving, even as her own had stopped. As they walked down Maple Hollow's familiar streets, Elizabeth felt the weight of each step. The houses looked the same, the old oak trees casting dappled light on the pavement. But she felt like a stranger in a place she had once called home. The yard sale bustled with life, families laughing, neighbors chatting, children playing in the sun. It was a scene of perfect normalcy, yet to Elizabeth, it all seemed distant, like a dream she could not touch. At the first table they stopped at, she found herself idly sifting through a box of old books, the musty scent of paper and ink, a bittersweet comfort. But it was at the third table that her breath caught in her throat. There, among a jumble of faded toys and trinkets, was a small teal Game Boy, the stickers on its plastic case worn but unmistakable. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, memories flooding back in a rush so powerful it stole her breath. She turned it over in her hands, each scuff mark and sticker a testament to the boy who had loved it so fiercely. Martha, seeing the color drain from her friend's face, asked softly, "Liz, what is it?" "This," Elizabeth whispered, her voice breaking. "This was Ethan's. I know it. I'd recognize it anywhere." She looked up at Martha, her eyes wide with a fragile hope that felt almost too dangerous to hold. "This is his." The man behind the table watched them silently, his expression unreadable. Elizabeth looked at him, her voice shaking. "Where did you get this?" she asked. The man hesitated, his fingers twitching at his side. "Just things people bring in," he said finally. "I don't remember." But Elizabeth could see something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, a shadow of guilt. She clutched the Game Boy tighter, her heart hammering in her chest. "Please," she said, her voice pleading, "tell me where you got it. My son, he's been missing for 10 years. This belonged to him. Please." The man shifted uneasily, glancing away. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice low. "I don't know anything else." He reached out as if to take the Game Boy back, but Elizabeth stepped away, holding it close as though it were a lifeline. Around them, the noise of the yard sale faded, the laughter and chatter turning into a distant hum. In that moment, nothing else existed but the worn plastic in her hands and the hope that maybe, just maybe, her son was still out there. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, Elizabeth felt the weight of the past pressing down on her. But, for the first time in years, she also felt the faintest glimmer of possibility. She did not know where this road would lead, or what she would find at its end, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would follow it, wherever it took her. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she held the small teal Game Boy close to her chest, its familiar weight grounding her in the swirl of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. The laughter of children in the yard sale seemed to fade into an echo as she stared at the man behind the table, his weathered face etched with an unsettling calm that only deepened her dread. Martha placed a reassuring hand on Elizabeth's shoulder, her steady presence an anchor in the sudden chaos of Elizabeth's thoughts. But even her warm touch couldn't silence the surge of questions that roared within. Elizabeth's voice cracked as she tried again, her words urgent but gentle. "Please, if you remember anything, even the smallest detail, I need to know. It's been 10 years, and I've lived every one of those days in the shadow of that loss." The man's eyes flickered, the mask of indifference slipping for the briefest of moments as he glanced around the bustling yard sale before leaning in just enough for his voice to drop to a low, conspiratorial whisper. "Lady, you're not the first to ask about that Game Boy. A young man came by a week ago asking about it too. Said it belonged to his brother, but he didn't seem quite right." Elizabeth's heart clenched in her chest, her breath catching on the ragged edge of hope and fear as she pressed him. "Did he give you a name? Did he say where he was staying?" The man shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. "No name, just said he was looking for something lost. He paid cash and didn't stay long." Martha's hand tightened on Elizabeth's arm as the gravity of those words sank in. The possibility that someone else was searching for the same piece of the past that Elizabeth now clung to. And for a fleeting moment, the world seemed to tilt. The possibility of answers both thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. The man's gaze shifted uneasily to the Game Boy in Elizabeth's hands. "Look, I don't want any trouble, lady. If you're going to take that, I'd rather you just go." And though his words were meant to dismiss her, they only fanned the flames of her determination. Elizabeth nodded slowly, her mind already racing ahead to what this could mean. How this small piece of plastic could be the key to unlocking the mystery that had consumed her life for a decade. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice steady even as her heart thundered. "I won't forget this." And with that, she turned away from the table, the teal Game Boy clutched tightly in her hand, like a talisman, warding off the darkness of uncertainty. Martha fell into step beside her, her expression one of cautious relief and worry. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her tone gentle but insistent, and Elizabeth took a deep breath, her mind already weaving together the threads of what she had just learned. I think someone out there knows more than they're saying, and if that young man was really searching for Ethan's Game Boy, then maybe he knows what happened. Maybe he can tell me where Ethan is now." Martha's brow furrowed. "Liz, you're talking about a complete stranger. What if it's just some coincidence?" But Elizabeth shook her head, her resolve hardening like steel. "I've lived with coincidences for 10 years, Martha, and I've learned that nothing in this world is truly random. Everything is connected if you know where to look." The two women walked in silence for a moment, the sounds of the yard sale washing over them like a distant tide. And as they reached Martha's car, Elizabeth paused, her eyes drifting over the familiar neighborhood that had once felt like home, but now seemed like a foreign country, its quiet streets hiding secrets she had never imagined. She turned to her friend, her voice soft but sure. "I need to find out who that young man is, where he came from, and what he knows." And though Martha hesitated, she nodded. "Then we'll do it together," she said, her loyalty a balm to Elizabeth's frayed nerves. They climbed into the car and pulled away from the yard sale, the teal Game Boy resting on Elizabeth's lap like a silent witness to the promise she had just made herself. As they drove through the winding streets of Willow Creek, the late afternoon sun slanting through the trees in golden rays, Elizabeth felt the first real sense of purpose she had known in years. A quiet certainty that the answers she had been searching for were finally within reach, waiting for her to find them. The drive back to Elizabeth's modest home on Sycamore Lane was quiet, the silence in the car thick with the weight of unspoken fears and the fragile hope that had begun to take shape. Elizabeth cradled the Game Boy in her hands, her fingers tracing the familiar curve of the device, as though she could will it to reveal the secrets it held. Martha watched her from the corner of her eye, her expression one of wary concern, as she finally spoke. "Liz, I know you're determined, but promise me you'll be careful. This isn't just about an old toy anymore." Elizabeth nodded absently, her mind already spinning with possibilities. "I know, Martha, but this is the first sign I've had in 10 years. I can't ignore it." Her voice was calm, but carried a quiet fire that Martha had not seen in her friend for a long time. As they pulled up to the house, the familiar shape of the front porch brought a pang of bittersweet memories. The echoes of Ethan's laughter still lingering in the corners of her mind, like a half-forgotten melody. She stepped out of the car and stood for a moment, the autumn air cool against her skin, before turning back to Martha. "I need to look at this, to see if there's anything left in it. Maybe a saved game, a name, something," she said, her voice low and almost reverent. Martha hesitated, then nodded. "I'll stay with you," she offered, her steady presence a comfort in the sudden rush of uncertainty that swept over Elizabeth. Together they stepped inside, the house silent, but for the gentle ticking of the old clock in the hallway. Elizabeth carried the Game Boy to the kitchen table and set it down with a kind of careful ritual, as though she were handling a relic of some ancient mystery rather than a battered children's toy. She retrieved a fresh pack of AA batteries from the drawer, and with trembling hands slid them into place, her breath catching in her throat as the device flickered to life with that familiar startup chime, the screen glowing softly in the dim light. For a moment, she simply stared at it, the memories of Ethan playing on the living room floor flooding back so vividly that her eyes stung with tears. She pressed the start button, and the familiar pixelated characters of a Pokemon game appeared, the cheerful music jarringly bright in the stillness of the kitchen. She navigated to the saved game data, her heart hammering as she read the name scrawled across the tiny screen. Ethan 8. Her breath caught, and Martha let out a soft gasp behind her, the simple name a confirmation that this was indeed her son's device. But beyond that, there was nothing. No messages, no clues, just the game itself, frozen in time like a tiny echo of the boy she had lost. Elizabeth set the Game Boy down carefully, her shoulders sagging under the weight of so much memory and so few answers. "It's his," she whispered, her voice cracking. "There's no doubt now, but what does it mean? How did it end up there after all these years?" Martha stepped closer, her hand on Elizabeth's shoulder. "It means you're right to keep looking," she said firmly, her tone gentle but insistent. Elizabeth nodded slowly, wiping away the tears that had gathered in her eyes. "I have to find that young man, the one who asked about this. He's the key. I know it?" Her voice was low but resolute, each word a vow to herself and to the memory of her son. They spent the rest of the afternoon piecing together what little they had. The man at the yard sale's description, the cryptic mention of a young man looking for a lost brother, the way he had seemed both desperate and haunted. It wasn't much, but it was enough to ignite the first real spark of hope Elizabeth had felt in a decade. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the windows of her quiet home, Elizabeth felt something shift within her, a quiet determination settling into her bones, a sense that this was only the beginning of a journey that would demand everything she had to give. She didn't know where it would lead, or what darkness she might uncover along the way. But she knew one thing with unwavering certainty. She would not stop, not until she had the answers she had spent 10 years searching for. And as she sat there, the Game Boy resting between her palms like a sacred promise, Elizabeth Carter vowed to bring the truth into the light, no matter what it cost her. That night, Elizabeth could not sleep, her mind replaying the conversation with the man at the yard sale over and over like a worn-out tape. Every detail burned into her thoughts as she lay in the darkness of her bedroom. The house was silent, but for the quiet ticking of the clock in the hallway, a steady rhythm that matched the racing beat of her own heart. She rose from her bed and padded down the hall to the kitchen, the Game Boy still resting on the table where she had left it, its small screen now dark and silent, but somehow still full of the echoes of her son's laughter. She ran her fingers over its smooth plastic surface, feeling the worn stickers beneath her fingertips, like tiny ghosts of the past, each one a testament to Ethan's love of the fantastical worlds he had once carried in his small hands. The night stretched long and heavy around her, the shadows of the house pressing close, but Elizabeth's mind was already turning, already planning, already refusing to let this small glimmer of hope fade away. She made a cup of tea and sat at the table, the steam curling in the cold air, as she pulled out her laptop and began to search, her fingers moving with quiet urgency over the keys. She started with the simplest question, the only one she had. The mention of the young man who had come to the yard sale before her, asking about the Game Boy, and who had seemed so out of place in that bright and bustling event. She searched through local forums and social media, typing in every variation she could think of, every detail that had lodged itself in her memory. Young man, lost brother, yard sale, teal Game Boy. The search turned up nothing at first, a blank wall of digital noise that offered no answers, but she kept going, driven by the conviction that somewhere in the endless sea of information was the thread that would lead her to the truth. Martha had offered to stay the night, but Elizabeth had gently refused, needing the quiet of the house and the solitude of her thoughts to feel close to her son, to the past that had never truly let her go. The hours crept by in silence, the glow of the screen, the only light in the dark kitchen, her eyes burning with exhaustion, but her resolve unbroken. At some point, long past midnight, she found it. A single post in a local community group, a message written in a hurried hand, the words almost lost in the flood of posts that crowded the page. "Looking for teal Game Boy. It belonged to my brother. Please contact if found." Her breath caught as she read and reread the simple plea, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and relief. Someone out there was searching, too, and if he was looking for the same Game Boy, then he was connected to Ethan's disappearance in some way. She was sure of it. She copied the message and stared at it for a long moment. her mind racing with questions. Who was this young man? What did he know? And why had he come looking for something that had been lost for so long? She crafted a careful reply, her words measured and precise, each sentence a lifeline thrown out into the dark. "I have the Game Boy. I need to talk to you. Please." She sent it, her hands trembling, and then sat back in her chair, the weight of her hope and her fear pressing down on her chest until it was almost hard to breathe. She knew she might be inviting danger into her life, but the need to know, to find the answers that had eluded her for so long, was stronger than any fear. She left the laptop open and sat there in the flickering light of the screen, the shadows of the kitchen stretching long around her, and waited for a reply that might bring her closer to the son she had lost. Dawn came slowly, the pale light of morning filtering through the kitchen window in soft gold and silver, and Elizabeth found herself still sitting at the table, her eyes gritty with fatigue, but her mind as sharp as a blade. She had not moved from her seat, the glow of the laptop screen still the only light in the room, casting long shadows that danced across the walls like the flickering images of old memories. Beside her, the Game Boy sat silent and still, its small, bright stickers a stark contrast to the weary lines on her face, as she waited for a response to her message. Martha arrived just as the sun crested the horizon, her face drawn with concern as she stepped into the quiet kitchen. "You've been up all night, haven't you?" she asked softly, and Elizabeth nodded, her voice a whisper. "I couldn't sleep, Martha, not when we might be so close to the truth." She turned the laptop screen to show her friend the post she had found, the hurried message and her own reply glowing faintly in the morning light. Martha's brows furrowed as she read, her fingers drumming nervously on the edge of the table. "Do you really think this person is connected to Ethan?" Elizabeth's eyes were fierce with certainty. "I feel it in my bones, Martha. He knows something, and I have to find out what it is." Her words were steady, but carried a quiet desperation that spoke of sleepless nights and endless hope. The hours passed slowly, the soft sounds of the waking world outside, the only interruption to the tense quiet of the kitchen. And then, just as Elizabeth was beginning to think that no answer would come, her phone chimed softly. A new message, a reply to her midnight plea. Her breath caught as she clicked it open, her heart thundering in her chest as she read the simple words. "Meet me at Riverfront Park, noon. I have something you need to see." Martha let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her hand tightening around Elizabeth's. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked, her voice low and anxious. But Elizabeth's answer was immediate, her resolve shining in her eyes. "I have to, Martha. I've been waiting for this moment for 10 years. They spent the next hours in quiet preparation, the Game Boy wrapped carefully in a small cloth and placed in Elizabeth's bag as though it were a sacred relic, its worn edges and faded stickers a testament to the memories it carried. As they drove to the park, the autumn air was crisp and cool, the trees lining the riverfront ablaze with color, their leaves a tapestry of red and gold that fluttered in the breeze like the last echoes of summer. Elizabeth sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her thoughts a maelstrom of fear and determination. She didn't know who she would meet at the park or what he might reveal, but she knew she could not turn back now, not when the possibility of finding her son's fate was finally within her grasp. As they pulled into the parking lot, the gentle murmur of the river reached her ears, a soothing contrast to the racing of her pulse, and she stepped out of the car with a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling over her like a mantle of quiet expectation. She scanned the park, her eyes searching for the young man she had never met, but felt as though she had been waiting for all her life. And when she saw him, a slender figure standing beneath the old oak tree by the river, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn jacket, she felt something shift inside her, a crack in the walls she had built around her heart. Martha touched her arm, her voice a soft thread of caution. "I'll be right here if you need me." And Elizabeth nodded, her gaze fixed on the stranger who might hold the answers she had spent a decade searching for. She walked across the grass, her steps slow and deliberate, the sound of the river and the rustle of leaves filling the air around her like a song she almost recognized. And as she approached, the young man looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of apprehension and something like hope. "Are you Elizabeth Carter?" he asked, his voice low and unsure, and she nodded, her own voice catching as she answered, "Yes, I'm Ethan's mother." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, two strangers bound by the invisible threads of a mystery that had spanned a decade. And in that quiet, shared space, Elizabeth felt the first true flicker of hope she had known in years, a fragile spark that she would protect with everything she had. The young man hesitated, shifting from foot to foot as though the words he carried were too heavy to speak, but Elizabeth could see the truth in his eyes, a shadow of something that had haunted him for years, something he needed to unburden. She took a step closer, her voice calm and low. "Please, if you know anything, I need you to tell me. My son, Ethan, he's been gone for 10 years. The young man swallowed hard, his gaze flicking to the river as he drew in a shaky breath. "My name is Tyler," he said finally, his words a confession. "And I think I know what happened to your son." Elizabeth's heart lurched in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. "Tell me," she urged, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag, as though she could will the answers to appear. Tyler's shoulders slumped, his voice low and almost broken as he spoke. "I was just a kid when it happened. I didn't understand what I saw, and when I got older, I convinced myself it was a dream, a nightmare, but it wasn't." He paused, his eyes distant as he remembered. "It was a party, a Halloween thing in the woods. Derek, he said it was just for fun, a scary game, but there was a boy there, and he was so scared. I didn't know who he was then, but now. I think it was Ethan." Elizabeth's breath came in shallow gasps, the name Derek cutting through her like a blade. She remembered the man from the yard sale, the one who had spoken of a lost brother. She felt the pieces falling into place, each word Tyler spoke a key turning in a lock that had been closed for too long. "What did you see?" she pressed, her voice trembling but steady, and Tyler's eyes met hers with a kind of pleading vulnerability. "We were just kids messing around with masks and lights, but Derek, he was different, intense, like he really believed in the monsters he was making up. He had this old cottage near the woods, said it was his family's. He called it the safe house." Elizabeth's skin prickled with cold dread, the image of the abandoned cottage from her childhood memory coming back to her in vivid flashes, and she leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. "Was Ethan there? Did you see him?" Tyler's jaw tightened, his eyes filling with a quiet anguish. "I think so. I saw a boy tied up in the basement, crying and calling for his mom, but Derek told us it was all part of the game, that the boy was in on it. He said he was just pretending, and I was too young to question it." A sob rose in Elizabeth's throat, her mind reeling with the horror of what she was hearing, but she forced herself to stay focused. "And now?" she asked, her voice sharp with an edge of steel. "What do you know now?" Tyler hesitated, then pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket, unfolding it with trembling hands to reveal an address scrawled in messy handwriting. "This is where Derek said he'd be tonight. He said it was the final game, that it would all be over after this." Elizabeth took the paper, her fingers brushing his as she whispered, "Thank you," the words simple but carrying the weight of her gratitude and her desperation. She turned back to Martha, who had been watching from a short distance, her face pale but determined, and together they read the address, a cabin deep in the woods, a place that felt both impossibly far away and unbearably close. Elizabeth slipped the paper into her bag, her voice calm but full of resolve. "We're going there," she said, and Martha didn't argue, only nodded with a quiet strength that matched Elizabeth's own. They walked back to the car, the morning sun now climbing higher in the sky, its light cold and sharp as a blade. Elizabeth felt the chill seep into her bones, but she welcomed it, let it harden her resolve and sharpen her focus. This was her chance, maybe the only one she would ever have, and she would not let it slip away. As they drove toward the cabin in the woods, the world outside blurred into a shifting tapestry of autumn color and memory, the past and present bleeding together in the steady rhythm of the road beneath their tires. Elizabeth held the Game Boy in her lap, her fingers brushing the stickers like a prayer, and she whispered into the silence of the car, "I'm coming for you, Ethan. I'm coming to bring you home." The drive to the cabin was a winding journey through dense woods and narrow roads, the canopy of autumn leaves overhead, casting shifting shadows across the windshield that seemed to echo the turmoil in Elizabeth's heart. She gripped the Game Boy tightly in her lap, her fingers tracing the stickers over and over as if they were a lifeline, each bright image a fragile connection to the son she had lost and the boy she was determined to find. Martha drove in focused silence, her eyes on the road, but her thoughts clearly mirroring Elizabeth's, the weight of what they were about to do, pressing down on them both like a physical force. The address Tyler had given them was a place neither woman had ever heard of, a name that spoke of hidden places and old secrets. Whispering Pines, it was called, and the name alone sent a shiver down Elizabeth's spine. As they turned off the main road and onto a narrow dirt track, the trees closed in around them, the bright morning light turning to a soft, eerie twilight in the thick shadows. Elizabeth's pulse quickened as the first glimpses of the cabin came into view, a weathered structure of gray wood and sagging shingles, half hidden by the overgrown brambles and twisted vines that seemed to guard it like sentinels. Martha cut the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening, the soft rustle of the leaves and the distant murmur of the river the only sounds in the air. They sat for a moment, gathering their courage in the cold stillness of the forest, and then Elizabeth turned to Martha, her voice low but resolute. "Stay here. If anything happens, call for help. But I need to do this alone." Martha hesitated, her hand on Elizabeth's arm. "Are you sure?" she asked, but Elizabeth only nodded, her eyes steady and unyielding. "This is my son. We've come this far, and I have to see it through." She stepped out of the car, the chill of the forest air biting at her skin as she walked toward the cabin, each step a silent promise to herself and to Ethan. The porch creaked under her weight as she approached, the door hanging slightly ajar, and the scent of damp earth and old wood wafting out to meet her. She paused for a moment, her hand on the weathered doorframe, and drew a deep breath, steadying her racing heart before pushing the door open and stepping inside. The air was thick and stale, the faint glow of a single bulb casting deep shadows in the small front room, where broken furniture and scattered papers spoke of years of neglect and abandonment. Elizabeth's eyes swept the space quickly, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she forced herself to move deeper into the house, the floorboards groaning softly under her feet. She could feel her pulse in her throat, her whole body thrumming with the certainty that she was close, so close to the truth she had been chasing for a decade. In the back of the cabin, a narrow hallway led to a small door, half concealed by an old, moth-eaten curtain, and something in the air shifted as she approached, a faint, sour smell that made her stomach tighten with dread. She pushed the door open slowly, her hand trembling on the knob, and what she saw made her blood run cold. A narrow staircase leading down into darkness, the faint glint of metal where a single flickering bulb cast its light. She hesitated only a moment before stepping down, her breath ragged in the cold air as she descended into the basement. The space below was small and dimly lit, the concrete walls stained with years of damp and decay, but it was the makeshift bed in the corner that caught her eye, the threadbare blanket rumpled and the faint scent of stale sweat hanging in the air. Her heart clenched as she saw the small pile of toys in the corner, action figures and battered cars, all worn and old, but each one a ghost of the childhood that had been stolen from her son. And there, in the center of the room, was the chair, a battered wooden seat with frayed ropes trailing from its arms, the sight of it a silent scream in the stillness. Elizabeth's knees went weak, and she had to grip the edge of the doorway to keep from collapsing, the weight of the years of fear and grief crashing over her in a tidal wave. But even as her tears blurred her vision, she forced herself to step forward, her voice a whisper in the cold air. "Ethan, I'm here, and I'm not leaving without you." The basement was empty, but she felt him there, in the faded stickers on the Game Boy in her hand and in the soft echoes of his laughter that still lived in her memory. She knew this was where he had been held, and even if he was no longer here, she would find him. She would bring him home, no matter what it took. She turned and climbed the stairs again, her steps firm and her resolve like iron, her heart carrying a single, unshakable truth. She would not stop until her son was safe in her arms once more. The air outside felt colder now, the late morning sun unable to warm the heavy weight of what Elizabeth had seen in that basement. And as she stepped out onto the porch, she saw Martha standing by the car, her face pale and drawn, her eyes full of unspoken questions. "What did you find?" Martha asked, her voice trembling in the quiet, but Elizabeth could only shake her head, her own voice failing her as she clutched the Game Boy tighter, the small device now feeling like the only piece of her son she could hold on to. "He was there," she managed finally, her voice breaking on the words. "He was there, Martha. I know it." Martha's face softened with sorrow and fear, but there was also determination in her eyes as she reached out and took Elizabeth's hand, her grip warm and steady. "Then we have to keep going," she said simply, and Elizabeth nodded, feeling the resolve settle deeper in her chest. They returned to the car and drove away from the cabin, the road winding through the forest like a living memory, each bend and turn a reminder of how close they had come to the edge of something dark and terrible. Elizabeth barely spoke as they drove, her thoughts consumed by the images of the basement and the small, broken pieces of the life that had been stolen from her son. They stopped only once, at a small diner on the edge of the forest, its neon sign flickering in the early afternoon light, and Elizabeth sat in the booth staring out the window, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she barely tasted as she tried to make sense of the pieces she had gathered. Martha sat across from her, her expression calm but watchful, and when Elizabeth finally spoke, it was with a quiet certainty that left no room for doubt. "We have to find Derek. He's the key to all of this." Martha nodded slowly, her voice low. "Do you think he'll tell us the truth?" Elizabeth's gaze was steady as she answered, "I don't know, but I'm going to make him." They left the diner and drove back toward town, the low hum of the engine a comforting rhythm in the tense silence between them. Elizabeth had always thought of herself as an ordinary woman, a mother, a wife, a friend, but in that moment she felt something deeper awaken inside her, a strength born of desperation and love, a refusal to let her son's story end in the shadows of that basement. When they reached the small police station on the edge of town, Elizabeth stepped out of the car with the Game Boy in her hand, the stickers bright and defiant against the dull gray of the day, and she walked through the doors with her shoulders straight and her head held high. Inside, the station was warm and brightly lit, the smell of coffee and old wood mingling with the low murmur of voices as officers went about their work. Detective Morrison was there, his calm eyes sharp as he looked up from his desk and saw Elizabeth approaching. He rose to meet her, his expression somber as he took in the worn edges of the Game Boy in her hand and the haunted determination in her eyes. "Elizabeth," he said gently, "you shouldn't be here. It's been a long day, and you need to rest." But Elizabeth shook her head, her voice firm as she placed the Game Boy on his desk, the stickers catching the light like a silent plea. "I found where he was, Detective. I saw the place where my son was kept, and I know Derek is involved." Morrison's face grew grave as he listened, his jaw tightening with the weight of her words. "Tell me everything," he said quietly, and she did. She told him about Tyler, about the cabin in the woods, about the basement and the rope scars on the chair and the faint smell of fear that still lingered in the air. She spoke with the quiet intensity of a mother who had nothing left to lose, her voice steady and unyielding as she painted a picture of the horror she had glimpsed and the hope she refused to surrender. When she finished, Morrison was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching her face for any sign of doubt, and then he nodded slowly, his voice low and resolute. "We'll bring him in, Elizabeth. We'll bring him in and find out the truth." As she watched him speak to his officers, his calm authority a steady anchor in the swirling storm of her thoughts, Elizabeth felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, fragile but real, a single light in the darkness she had been living in for a decade. She stepped back from the desk, her breath coming slow and even as she watched the officers gather their gear, the quiet determination in their movements a mirror of her own. She knew the road ahead would be long and full of shadows, but she also knew one thing with a certainty that burned in her chest like a flame. She would not stop until she found her son, until she brought him home where he belonged. The police station bustled with a quiet urgency as the officers prepared to leave, their radios crackling softly with updates and instructions, but Elizabeth barely heard them, her mind fixed on the image of the basement and the boy who had been lost for so long. She watched as Detective Morrison slipped on his jacket, his movements precise and measured, and she saw in his face the same resolve that had carried her here, the same determination to find the answers that had eluded them for a decade. He turned to her, his voice calm and even. "We'll take you back home, Elizabeth. Martha will stay with you. I'll call you as soon as we have something." But Elizabeth shook her head, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the strap of her bag. "I need to be there, Detective. I need to see this through." Morrison hesitated, his brow furrowing with concern, but then he nodded slowly, the unspoken understanding between them clear and steady. "Stay close to me, no matter what happens, Stay close! The drive to the address Tyler had given them was quiet and tense, the weight of what they might find hanging over them like a storm. Elizabeth sat in the back seat, her fingers tracing the edges of the Game Boy as the car wound through the narrow roads and the forest closed in around them, the late afternoon sun slipping behind the trees and casting long shadows across the dashboard. Beside her, Martha reached over and took her hand, her grip firm and reassuring, a silent promise that she was not alone in this. When they arrived, the property was shrouded in an eerie calm, the low wooden fence and the old gate creaking softly in the breeze as the officers stepped out and began their approach. The cabin loomed ahead, its weathered walls and sagging roof, a stark contrast to the bright reds and golds of the autumn leaves that carpeted the ground, and Elizabeth felt her heart pound in her chest, the weight of the years pressing down on her with every step she took. Detective Morrison raised his hand, his voice low but firm as he called out, "Police, come out with your hands where we can see them." There was no response, only the soft rustle of the wind through the trees, and Elizabeth felt her breath catch in her throat, the silence pressing in around them like a living thing. The officers moved forward, their movements precise and careful, their eyes scanning every window and shadow for signs of movement, and Elizabeth stayed close behind them, her heart a drumbeat in her ears. When they reached the door, Morrison paused, his hand on the handle as he turned to look at her, his eyes steady and calm. "Stay behind me," he said again, and she nodded, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps as he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air inside was cold and still, the faint scent of mildew and old wood wrapping around them like a shroud as they moved through the narrow hallway, their flashlights cutting through the darkness in long, thin beams. Elizabeth's eyes flicked from shadow to shadow, her mind racing with the thought of her son somewhere in this place, his small voice calling out for her in the night. They reached the basement door, the same narrow staircase she had seen in her nightmare, and Morrison motioned for one of the officers to open it, the hinges creaking softly as the door swung back and the darkness below yawned open like a mouth. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat, the cold air of the basement washing over her as they stepped carefully down the stairs, each footstep a quiet echo in the stillness. The basement was empty, the chair in the corner just as she had seen it before, the ropes trailing from its arms like the ghosts of a memory, and Elizabeth felt her knees go weak, her fingers digging into the railing as she forced herself to keep moving forward. Morrison's voice was calm and steady, his flashlight sweeping over every inch of the space as he spoke softly to the officers. "Check for signs of recent activity. Look for anything that doesn't belong." They moved methodically, their movements deliberate and sure, but Elizabeth's eyes were drawn to the corner of the room where the small pile of toys still lay. The battered cars and action figures, a mute testament to the childhood her son had been denied. She knelt beside them, her fingers brushing the dust from the bright plastic, her breath catching as she closed her eyes and whispered his name. "Ethan, my sweet boy, I'm here." The officers found nothing else in the basement, no sign of recent habitation, no sign of the boy who had lived there in the darkness, and when they finally climbed the stairs again, Elizabeth felt the weight of the years settle over her shoulders like a shroud, the knowledge that her son had been here but was gone again, cutting deep into her heart. Outside, the air was sharp and cold, the last rays of the sun painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold as the officers gathered around Morrison, their faces grave and tense. "We'll keep looking," he promised her, his voice quiet but firm, and Elizabeth nodded, her eyes dry and unblinking as she stared back at the cabin, the place that had stolen so much from her but could not take her resolve. She turned to Martha, her voice steady and sure. "We're not done, not until we find him." And Martha nodded, her arm around Elizabeth's shoulders as they walked back to the car, the long shadows of the trees stretching out behind them, like the past reaching for them from the dark. The drive back to town was quiet, the hum of the engine a low, steady heartbeat in the tense silence that wrapped around them both. Elizabeth stared out the window, her eyes fixed on the shifting patterns of light and shadow on the road ahead. But her mind was far away, lost in the echoes of that dark basement and the memories that clung to her like a second skin. Martha sat beside her, her hand resting on Elizabeth's knee, a silent reassurance that she wasn't alone in this, even though the weight of what they had seen threatened to swallow them both whole. As they neared the edge of town, the soft glow of streetlights began to pierce the deepening twilight, and Elizabeth felt the first stirrings of a plan forming in her mind, a fragile hope that flickered to life in the darkness. "We need to find Derek," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the quiet of the car. But Martha heard her, her head turning sharply as she met Elizabeth's gaze. "He's the key to all of this," Elizabeth continued, her fingers tightening around the Game Boy in her lap, the stickers bright against the fading light. "He knows where Ethan is, I'm sure of it." Martha nodded slowly, her own face hardening with determination. "Then we'll find him," she said simply, her voice as resolute as the set of her jaw. And Elizabeth felt a flicker of gratitude, the warmth of her friend's loyalty, a steady light in the storm of her thoughts. They drove to the police station, the low brick building bathed in the golden glow of the street lamps, and Elizabeth stepped out of the car with the Game Boy still clutched in her hand, the weight of it grounding her as she pushed open the door and stepped inside. Detective Morrison was waiting for them, his face grave but calm as he rose to meet her, his eyes flicking to the worn device in her hand before meeting hers. "Elizabeth," he said gently, "we've checked every lead we have. There's nothing else at the cabin. No sign that Derek was ever there." But Elizabeth shook her head, her voice firm and steady, despite the exhaustion that tugged at her bones. "He was there, Detective. I know he was. He's not done with this. Not yet." Morrison studied her face for a long moment, the quiet conviction in her voice a challenge he couldn't ignore, and then he nodded, his expression hardening with resolve. "We'll bring him in," he said, his voice low and sure. "We'll question him again, see what else he's hiding." Elizabeth nodded, her breath coming slow, and even as she stepped back, her eyes fixed on Morrison as he turned and began issuing quiet orders to the officers around him. The low murmur of voices and the shuffle of feet filled the air, but Elizabeth barely heard it, her mind fixed on the single, unwavering thought that had carried her this far. She would not stop. Not now. Not when she was this close. When the officers finally left, Elizabeth and Martha stood in the cool night air outside the station, the soft hum of traffic and the distant glow of neon signs painting the quiet streets in shades of gold and blue. Martha slipped her arm around Elizabeth's shoulders, her voice soft but sure. "We'll find him, Liz. Whatever it takes, we'll find him." And Elizabeth nodded, her eyes bright with the fierce light of hope, her breath a quiet vow in the darkness. "I know, Martha. I know we will." The night stretched long and silent as Elizabeth lay awake in the small bedroom Martha had prepared for her, the shadows on the walls dancing in the pale light of the moon that streamed through the window. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flicker of the Game Boy's screen, the faint outlines of Ethan's name etched into the back of the plastic case, and she clutched it to her chest as if it could keep him close, a fragile talisman against the darkness that still lingered around them. Downstairs, she could hear Martha moving quietly through the kitchen, the soft clink of dishes and the low murmur of her voice as she spoke to someone on the phone, her words too soft to make out, but the steady cadence of them a quiet comfort in the stillness. Elizabeth turned her face into the pillow, her mind racing with memories of Ethan's laughter, the way his small hands had once wrapped around hers, the way his eyes had sparkled when he showed her his latest treasure from the backyard. Those memories felt like a lifetime ago, but she clung to them now with a desperate intensity, refusing to let them be swallowed by the shadows that pressed in around her. She thought of Derek, his face pale and tight with secrets, the flicker of something dark in his eyes when she had seen him at the yard sale, and she knew, deep in her bones, that he held the answers she needed, the key to bringing her son home. She rose quietly and crossed to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she looked out over the quiet street, the faint glow of streetlights painting the cracked pavement in shades of gold and silver. Somewhere out there, she thought, Ethan was waiting for her. Somewhere out there, her boy was still alive, and she would not stop until she held him in her arms again. When she turned back to the bed, she found Martha standing in the doorway, her face shadowed but her eyes steady and kind. "You should try to sleep," she said softly, her voice gentle. But Elizabeth shook her head, her own voice firm despite the weariness that tugged at her. "I can't, not yet." Martha crossed the room and took her hand, her fingers warm and solid in the cool night air. "We'll find him, Liz," she said quietly, her voice a promise that cut through the darkness. "We'll bring him home." Elizabeth nodded, her throat tight with gratitude and fear, and something that felt almost like hope, and she sank down onto the edge of the bed, her hand still wrapped around the Game Boy like a lifeline. As the hours slipped by, she let herself drift in the quiet, her mind replaying every moment of the day, every clue and shadow and whispered word that might lead her back to her son. And when sleep finally came, it was fitful and fragile, but it carried with it a single, unbreakable thought. She would not give up, no matter how long it took, no matter how far she had to go. She would not stop until Ethan was safe in her arms again. Morning light seeped slowly through the curtains, pale and uncertain, as Elizabeth woke to the muted sounds of Martha making coffee in the kitchen, the rich aroma drifting up the narrow staircase to where she sat on the edge of the bed. She blinked sleep from her eyes, the weight of the night still heavy on her shoulders, but the fierce resolve she had felt the day before burned brighter than ever in her chest. She rose and crossed to the small dresser where she had placed the Game Boy, its bright stickers a silent testament to everything she had lost and everything she still had to fight for. She ran her fingers over the worn plastic, a quiet prayer forming in the back of her mind. Please let him be safe. Let him still be out there waiting for me. Downstairs, Martha's voice floated up to her, calm and steady as she spoke to someone on the phone, and Elizabeth felt a surge of gratitude for her friend's unwavering strength. She dressed quickly, her movements precise and deliberate, each button and fold a silent ritual of preparation. And when she stepped into the kitchen, she found Martha waiting with a mug of steaming coffee, her face drawn but determined. "You need to eat something," Martha said softly, but Elizabeth shook her head, her voice quiet but firm. "I can't. I need to go back to the station, see if they've found Derek." Martha didn't argue, only nodded and pressed the warm mug into her hands, her eyes kind but unyielding. "Then take this at least. Keep your strength up." Elizabeth sipped the coffee, its warmth a small comfort against the cold knot of fear in her stomach, and she watched as Martha gathered her keys and coat, the quiet efficiency of her movements a balm to Elizabeth's racing thoughts. Together, they drove through the waking streets of the small town, the early morning light painting the cracked pavement in soft gold and rose, the houses and trees slowly coming to life as the world stirred around them. At the police station, the atmosphere was tense, the low murmur of voices and the flicker of computer screens, a steady backdrop to the quiet storm of Elizabeth's thoughts. Detective Morrison met them at the door, his face grave but resolute as he led them back to his office, the walls lined with maps and photos that spoke of years of searching, of hope that refused to die. "We picked up Derek last night," he said quietly, his eyes meeting Elizabeth's with the weight of unspoken truths. "He's in one of the interview rooms now. He's agreed to talk to you, but you need to be careful, Elizabeth." She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest, every breath a quiet mantra of strength and resolve. And when Morrison led her down the narrow hallway to the small room at the end, she felt the gravity of the moment settle over her like a cloak. Derek sat at the table, his hands folded in front of him, his face pale and drawn in the harsh fluorescent light. His eyes flicked up as she entered, a flicker of something, fear, maybe, or something darker, passing through them before his expression went blank and cold. Elizabeth drew a deep breath, her voice calm and steady as she took the seat across from him, the Game Boy in her hands a silent accusation between them. "Tell me where he is, Derek," she said quietly, her words cutting through the stale air like a blade. "Tell me what you did with my son." For a long moment, he said nothing, his eyes fixed on her with a cold, distant calm that made her skin crawl, but then he leaned forward, his voice low and even. "You don't understand, Elizabeth," he said softly, his words almost gentle. "I was trying to protect him. I was the only one who could keep him safe." Elizabeth felt her breath catch, her fingers tightening around the Game Boy as she fought to keep her voice steady. "Safe from what, Derek? From me? From the world? He's my son. He belongs with me." Derek's eyes flickered again, something dark and twisted moving behind them, and he shook his head slowly. "No, you don't understand," he repeated, his voice growing more insistent. "They would have hurt him, Elizabeth. They would have destroyed everything he was, everything he could have been. I was the only one who could keep him whole." Elizabeth felt the words like a knife in her chest, the raw conviction in his voice twisting something deep inside her. But she refused to let him see her fear, her anger. She leaned forward, her voice a whisper of steel. "You're lying, Derek. You stole him from me. You stole 10 years of his life. Where is he? Where is Ethan?" Derek's mouth tightened, his knuckles whitening on the table, and for a moment she saw the flicker of something. Doubt, maybe, or regret. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold mask he wore like armor. "He's safe," he said softly, almost tenderly. "That's all you need to know." Elizabeth felt the fury rise in her throat, her hands trembling as she pushed back from the table, the Game Boy clutched tight in her fingers. "No! Derek! That's not enough," she said, her voice shaking with the force of her rage. "I will not stop until I find him. I will tear down every wall, every lie, until I bring him home." For a moment, there was only silence, the air between them thick with the weight of everything left unsaid, and then she rose and turned away, her breath ragged. Elizabeth walked out of the interview room with her shoulders squared and her head held high, the echo of Derek's words still ringing in her ears, but her resolve stronger than ever. She could feel Martha's gaze on her as she stepped into the hallway, the quiet concern in her friend's eyes, a steady presence that anchored her, even as the world felt like it was spinning out of control. Detective Morrison joined them moments later, his face set in grim lines as he closed the door to the interview room behind him. "He's still not giving us anything concrete," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she and Martha could hear. "But we're not giving up. We'll keep pushing him." Elizabeth nodded, her fingers tightening around the Game Boy in her hand, the weight of it a quiet reminder of everything she was fighting for. "I need to see the cabin again," she said suddenly, her voice calm but urgent, and Morrison blinked in surprise. "We've already searched it thoroughly," he reminded her. "There's nothing there." "I don't care," Elizabeth said firmly, her eyes locked on his with a steady intensity that brooked no argument. "There's something there, I know it. Maybe it's not physical evidence, but it's a feeling. I need to go back." Morrison hesitated, then finally nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll take you." The drive to the old cabin was quiet, the low murmur of the police radio the only sound in the car as they wound through the narrow back roads that led to the property. The late afternoon sun was sinking low in the sky, the trees casting long shadows across the cracked pavement, and Elizabeth watched the light flicker through the leaves like a promise, her heart a quiet drumbeat of hope and fear. When they reached the cabin, she stepped out of the car and paused for a moment, taking in the sagging porch and the weathered siding, the way the light caught on the broken windows and the peeling paint. It felt like a place out of time, a relic of something half remembered and half forgotten, and she drew a slow breath before stepping forward. Inside, the air was cool and musty, the faint smell of old wood and damp earth mingling in the shadows. She moved carefully, her eyes searching every corner, every crack in the floorboards, her fingers brushing lightly over the worn surfaces, as if she could coax the truth from the very walls. Morrison followed a few steps behind, his flashlight cutting through the gloom as he watched her with quiet concern. "What are you hoping to find here, Elizabeth?" he asked softly, his voice echoing in the empty space. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I have to look. I have to try." In the small back room, she paused, her gaze catching on a faint scuff mark on the floor, a place where the dust had been disturbed as if something heavy had been dragged across it. She knelt down, her fingers tracing the mark with a quiet intensity, and when she looked up at Morrison, her eyes were bright with a sudden fierce determination. "He was here," she said quietly, her voice steady and sure. "I don't know how I know it, but he was here. This is where he kept Ethan." Morrison studied her for a long moment, then finally nodded, his expression shifting from doubt to quiet respect. "We'll bring in the forensics team again," he said. "We'll go over every inch of this place, inch by inch, if that's what it takes." Elizabeth stood slowly, her fingers brushing the Game Boy in her pocket as she turned back to the door. Outside, the light was fading, the sky painted in deep blues and purples as the sun slipped below the horizon. But she felt no fear in the encroaching darkness. She would not stop. She would not be deterred. Ethan was out there, waiting for her, and she would bring him home. The next day dawned cold and clear, the early morning light casting long golden rays across the empty streets of the small town. Elizabeth stood at the window of the modest guest room where she'd been staying, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, as she watched the sun climb slowly above the horizon. The light caught on the edges of the frost that still clung to the grass, turning the world outside into a fragile, glimmering dreamscape, and for a moment she let herself believe that it was a sign, a quiet promise that the darkness was finally beginning to lift. Martha joined her a moment later, her own coffee steaming in the cool air, and they stood together in a comfortable silence, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between them like a living thing. "Are you ready?" Martha asked softly, and Elizabeth nodded, her jaw set with quiet determination. "I am," she said. "We're going to find him today. I can feel it." At the police station, the mood was tense but focused, the officers moving with a kind of quiet urgency that spoke of long hours and frayed nerves. Detective Morrison met them at the door, his face drawn but resolute as he filled them in on the latest developments. "We've got a lead," he said. "One of the forensics teams found a partial fingerprint in the back room of the cabin. It matches Ethan's." Elizabeth felt her breath catch in her throat, her fingers tightening around the warm cup as a flicker of hope surged through her chest. "Then he was there," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "He was really there." Morrison nodded. "We're expanding the search. There's an old well on the property that was boarded up years ago. We're bringing in equipment to check it out just in case. And we're also trying to locate anyone Derek might have been in contact with recently." Elizabeth listened quietly, her mind racing with every possibility, every dark twist of what might have happened in that cabin. But she refused to let the fear take root. "I want to be there," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "When they search the well, I need to see it for myself." Morrison hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right," he said, "but stay with me. I don't want you getting too close." They drove out to the cabin again, the police convoy moving like a silent, determined procession through the winding back roads. The morning air was crisp and cold, the sun climbing higher as they pulled up to the sagging porch and the weathered door. Elizabeth stepped out of the car, her breath clouding in the chilly air, and she followed Morrison around to the back of the property, where the well sat half hidden in the tangle of dead leaves and overgrown weeds. The boards that covered it were old and weathered, the wood dark with age and damp, and Elizabeth felt a shiver run through her as the officers pried them loose, the heavy boards groaning as they were pulled away to reveal the yawning darkness below. She stepped closer, her hands trembling as she peered into the shadows, and for a moment the world seemed to go silent around her, the only sound the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. She could feel Ethan's presence in that darkness, a quiet echo of everything she had lost and everything she still hoped to find, and she closed her eyes for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. "We're going to lower a camera down," Morrison said quietly beside her, his voice steady and calm. "If there's anything down there, we'll find it." Elizabeth nodded, her fingers brushing against the Game Boy in her pocket, the small plastic device warm against her skin. It was a promise, a quiet vow that she would not stop until she had her son back in her arms. The officers worked quickly, setting up the camera and feeding it slowly into the darkness of the well. The small screen flickered to life, the pale, ghostly images of the stone walls sliding past in the dim glow of the camera light. Elizabeth watched, her breath tight in her chest, as the camera descended deeper and deeper, the darkness pressing in around them like a living thing. Then suddenly, a flicker of movement on the screen. A scrap of cloth, pale and worn, tangled in the rough stones of the well wall. Elizabeth felt her knees go weak, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared at the tiny screen, her heart pounding in her chest. "Is that?" she whispered, and Morrison nodded, his own expression tense. "We'll get it," he said. "We'll find out what it is." The officers worked quickly, carefully lowering a small grabber tool down into the darkness. The screen shuddered and flickered as the tool closed around the scrap of cloth, pulling it slowly back up into the light. When they finally pulled it free, Elizabeth reached out with trembling fingers, the worn fabric soft and fragile in her hands. It was a piece of Ethan's shirt. She remembered it. The small blue stripes, the tiny tear in the hem where he'd snagged it on a fence the summer before he disappeared. She pressed it to her chest, her eyes filling with tears. And for a moment, the world went silent around her, the weight of her grief and her hope folding in on itself in the quiet of the winter morning. "We're close," she said softly, her voice a quiet prayer. We're so close. The winter sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in soft streaks of rose and gold, as Elizabeth stood by the well with the piece of cloth clutched in her hands. The quiet weight of it, a testament to everything she had fought for and everything she still had to do. Around her, the police worked methodically, their movements calm but urgent as they continued to search the property, every shadow and corner combed for any sign of Ethan, and Elizabeth watched them with a quiet, fierce determination in her eyes. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that there were still questions without answers and shadows without light. But in that moment, she felt the first fragile flicker of hope begin to grow inside her, a small, stubborn flame that refused to die. Detective Morrison approached her slowly, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes bright with something like respect. We've found a tunnel, he said quietly, and Elizabeth turned to him with her breath caught in her throat. A tunnel? She repeated, her voice a hushed echo of disbelief. Morrison nodded. It looks like it leads away from the well, maybe to another part of the property, or maybe to somewhere else entirely. We're going to follow it, but I want you to stay here. It could be dangerous. Elizabeth hesitated for only a moment, then shook her head, her voice steady and sure. No, she said. I need to be there. I need to see it for myself. Morrison studied her for a long moment, then finally nodded, a small smile flickering at the corners of his mouth. All right, he said, but stay close to me. They descended into the well slowly, the narrow tunnel twisting away into the darkness like a secret waiting to be revealed. The air was cold and damp, the walls slick with moisture, and the faint smell of earth and old stone clinging to the back of her throat. But Elizabeth didn't falter. She moved carefully, her breath steady and her heart pounding in her chest, every step a quiet promise that she would not stop, that she would not turn away from the truth, no matter how dark it might be. The tunnel opened up into a small, hidden chamber, the flicker of the police flashlights catching on the rough stone walls and the scattered debris that littered the floor. In the center of the room, a makeshift bed had been laid out, a thin mattress and a threadbare blanket, the pale blue of it washed out and worn. And there, sitting huddled against the wall, was Ethan. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat, a soft, choked sob escaping her lips as she fell to her knees, her fingers trembling as she reached out to him. Ethan, she whispered, her voice a soft, desperate prayer. Ethan, baby, it's me. It's Mom. I'm here. For a long moment, he didn't move, his eyes wide and blank as he stared at her, the flicker of the flashlight dancing across his pale, dirt-streaked face. But then, slowly, something in his expression shifted, a flicker of recognition, a small, fragile spark of hope. Mom, he whispered, his voice hoarse and raw, and Elizabeth felt her heart break and mend all at once at the sound of it. Yes, she said, tears streaming down her face as she reached for him, her hands warm and steady on his cold, trembling skin. Yes, baby. I'm here. I've got you now. I'm not going to let you go. Around them, the police worked quietly, their voices low and careful as they called in the medics and prepared to lead them back to the surface. But in that moment, there was only Ethan. Only the warmth of his small, shaking body in her arms and the quiet, fierce certainty that they would face whatever came next together. As they made their way back through the tunnel and up into the pale winter twilight, Elizabeth held her son close, her heart a quiet drumbeat of love and hope and fierce, unwavering strength. She knew that there would be challenges ahead, that healing would be a long and difficult journey for both of them. But as she stepped out of the darkness and into the waiting light, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Ethan was home, and she would never stop fighting for him again. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of love, loss, and unbreakable hope. This story reminds us all that even in the darkest moments, a mother's determination can shine a light strong enough to bring her child back home. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it so others can feel the power of resilience and courage. Comment below with your thoughts. What would you have done in Elizabeth's shoes? And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you'll never miss another tale of hope and mystery. Until next time, stay strong, stay hopeful, and stay with us.